Hi and welcome to Gamba tutorial number 16. This is going to be about the Port-de-voix, what we would call the appoggiatura, the leaning note. It's going to be a slightly complicated video in that there are two ways of looking at this. There's the sort of slightly simplified way, which is the sort of generalized approach in modern early music performance. And there's also a more detailed way of looking at it, and so I'm going to split this video into two halves. I'm going to start with the sort of relatively straightforward way of approaching it, so that you can just use this part of the video to get playing, and then if you are interested in the slightly more nitty-gritty, you can stick around to the second half and we'll look at the subject in a little bit more detail. The Port-de-voix, the leaning note, is quite a well-established, there's quite a well-established approach to it, based on a number of authors who write about it, describe it in the 18th century. And this, the appoggiatura, the Port-de-voix, is, as is still the case today, usually in Baroque France, notated with a little note, a sort of attached little note that they called the petite note perdue, the little lost notes. The problem with that is that the little notes are rarely notated in the value that they're supposed to be played. So, for example, in Marais, they are almost always, notated as little semiquavers, even if the duration that they imply is much longer. It can be up to a crotchet's worth of length. And because of this, we need to, of course, again, to refer to treatises from the time. Now, there are a lot of authors who write about the Port-de-voix. Some of the main ones are Quantz's treatise on flute playing, and also Ornaments treatise on flute playing, and the Couperin pièce de clavecin prefaces, where he describes his keyboard ornaments, which one has to use carefully as a viol player, because the keyboard ornaments were often really quite different to the ornaments that viol players used. But these treatises all say that the Port-de-voix in the 18th century was what we call an on-beat leaning note, which is to say that the little note that is attached to the main note is played at the moment of the main note, so on the beat of the main note. It doesn't precede that note, but it happens at the same time. You can see that in this example from Dupart, his suites, keyboard suites, where he writes them out. The little comma in his case is how he annotates the Port-de-voix, and so we have he writes out the way it's realized. So we have not. So they are on beat. We can also learn from these treatises that, generally speaking, the Port-de-voix takes up half the value of a note if that note is of even length. So, for example, a Port-de-voix on a crotchet will take up a quaver's length of that crotchet. However, if the note is dotted, this is what Quantz describes anyway, if the note is dotted, then the leaning note takes up 2/3 of that main note. So if we're playing a Port-de-voix on a dotted crotchet, the leaning note takes up the first 2 quavers of that dotted crotchet. So essentially the crotchet. There are various types of leaning note. They appear both as ascending, usually from the note immediately below the main note. They can also fall, so they can be descending, and many French viol writers actually describe this as a separate ornament. They call it the coulée. Contextually, they also very often accompany trills, and also battements. We'll look at that in a moment. Their musical function is to create dissonance. And usually you'll find that the written leaning note, the written appoggiatura, the little note, will actually create a dissonance with either a chord that one plays as the soloist simultaneously with the leaning note, the Port-de-voix, or with the continuo, the notes in the accompaniment. And as a result of this, the leaning note will often require a bigger phrasal emphasis. So you play the leaning note louder and then phrase away as it resolves to the main written note. And as a result of this, composers of vocal music often used the Port-de-voix to illustrate very long syllables that were considered grammatically long, but also to illustrate much more intense emotional subjects. And we can see an example of this from this air by Monteclair, where at the end, the very final note, as is quite often the case, he uses an ascending Port-de-voix to create really quite a strong dissonance on that final syllable. And it's the final syllable of the word douleur, or pain. And so we get this really intense with the D in the background, in the bass, and it's really quite a powerful device used in this very rhetorical way. The Port-de-voix is also very often accompanied by a battement, and I mentioned this in the previous video. The battement is very, very commonly used to terminate a Port-de-voix. So you'll have the leaning note, then the main note, and the main note will be ornamented by a battement. So here's an example from a Marais Menuet from the third book, and he writes the leaning note is an extension of the B at the end of this first bar, and the main note, the C, is ornamented both by the Port-de-voix and also by the battement. So, as is implied by the order of the symbols, you play first the leaning note and then the battement. So it would look something like this. I'll do that again. And again, you'll notice that the leaning note, the B, creates a dissonance with the A in the bass. So it's quite an intense moment of dissonance. So if we play the Port-de-voix with an A, you'll see what I mean. It's quite a mournful sort of harmony. And again, the important thing is therefore to really lean into the Port-de-voix, and then the battement finishes the main note, and which really needs to be phrased off. Another context in which you'll find the Port-de-voix is when you're playing chords. We have to remember when we find ourselves in this situation that if we're playing the Port-de-voix on the beat, then the Port-de-voix will always coincide with the rest of the chord and will then be followed by the note to which it's attached. So to explain that, here are some examples. First one is a relatively straightforward example where the Port-de-voix is tied to only a two-note chord. So because we don't need to build this chord up from the bottom, we can play both the F sharp and the D minims simultaneously. We have to take into account that the Port-de-voix will beat the D to it. It'll be played instead of the D, so we're playing C sharp instead of D. And so when I get to the chord, I'm going to play the C sharp, the little leaning note, at the same time as the F sharp, and then terminate the Port-de-voix, with the D and the battement. So I'll demonstrate this. So the Port-de-voix takes up roughly half the length of the minim and is played at the same time simultaneously with the F sharp. I'll do it again. Now, you'll also encounter the Port-de-voix in the context of larger chords. which require more strings. So here's another example. Now we can't play all three of these notes simultaneously. We've got to build up from the C at the bottom all the way through the G in the middle and then to the top note. As with the previous example, the Port-de-voix, in this case a B, will necessarily be played before the top main note of the chord, the C. So we have to keep our first finger down. As with almost every context in which you'll find Port-de-voix, the Port-de-voix itself is preceded by a main note of the same pitch. So in this case, the B upbeat to this bar. So I'll play the B, keep my first finger where it is, and then build up from the bottom of this chord. And instead of playing the C at the top, I'll play the B, and again it'll take up roughly half the value of the note, followed by the C with the battement. So something like this. One more time. And again, here the B provides dissonance with the C that's still ringing. So it's another expressive rhetorical device. That is all there is to Port-de-voix, at least in the simplistic approach. So to summarize, the Port-de-voix happens on the beat. It takes up half the value of an even valued note, or 2/3 of the value of a dotted note. They're very often accompanied by or terminated by the battement. They also will often appear in the context of trills, as we saw in the first video, where one has this leaning note, the appui, which in itself is a form of Port-de-voix. And generally, the Port-de-voix needs to be emphasized over and above the note to which it's attached, so the Port-de-voix is louder than the attached note. Now, we're going to start the second part of this video, where we're going to look in a little bit more detail, because the picture is not quite as simple as all that. It's not always the case that the Port-de-voix happens on the beat. And in fact, there's quite a lot of controversy if you read the various treatises from the 17th century that describe French Baroque viol technique. For example, it's not always obvious that Maré's trills should be played on the beat. Sometimes it actually seems technically more appropriate to play a pre-beat Port-de-voix. Here's an example from one of his sarabans in the second book, and here in the second bar he writes a Port-de-voix tied to a chord, a two-note chord, in which the lower note is trilled. Now it is possible to play this, play the Port-de-voix here on the beat, but it's rather awkward, and it involves playing both the Port-de-voix and the upper appui, the leaning note of the trill, at the same time. And you have to use slightly convoluted fingering in order to get this to happen. And in a way you lose the impact of the upper Port-de-voix, the little note, because it's sort of subsumed by the leaning note of the trill. However, if the Port-de-voix is pre-beat, which is to say we play the Port-de-voix and then we play the chord with the trill, then we get a much greater sense of dissonance. Not solid proof, but it's certainly more straightforward to play and provides a more piquant dissonance. In general, though, it does seem likely that Maré largely wanted his Port-de-voix played on the beat. But, to confuse things even further, there is quite a lot of evidence that viol players did fairly commonly play these Port-de-voix, the leaning notes, before a beat. The two of the main viol composer, writers, players who describe this are Danneville and Jean Rousseau. Danneville says that the Port-de-voix is made by cutting by half the note which precedes the one on which we will carry the voice. So in other words, which precedes the note ornamented by the port-de-voix. And by taking the last half of the preceding note, one slurs it with the one that follows. The famous authors do not use any other method. So Rousseau agrees with this, more or less. He admits that actually you can do the port-de-voix before the beat as well as on the beat, and he actually provides examples of this. He's not particularly consistent, but he does say that, well, we can look at the examples here. The first example is a pre-beat port-de-voix. So he provides both the ornament and its realization. So rather than, in this first bar, rather than playing, he plays, and he provides another example, an even faster example, where the port-de-voix is taken from the value of the preceding quaver. So it turns into a semiquaver worth of leaning note. So it sounds like this. He also says that you can play on the beat, and he's not particularly clear about when this is appropriate. But he provides an example very much like the one, the third example on here, which looks almost exactly the same as the second bar. But in this third bar, he says, no, you're supposed to play it on the beat. So this is, in a way, is helpful because it tells us that there were a variety of approaches, but he doesn't really clarify the context in which one should make this decision. To further complicate matters, the vocal composer and teacher, Bertrand or Bénigne de Bassy, describes a port-de-voix that is both on beat and pre-beat. And he describes, he doesn't provide annotated examples, but he says that the port-de-voix should be taken from the note preceding the ornamented note, as described by Danneville and Rousseau, but then that note should be sustained through the beat of the main note, and then the main note is articulated after the beat. So he starts the leaning note before, it takes it from the value of the preceding note, and sustains it through the main note before playing the main note. And I'll use some examples to explain this. To illustrate all of this, I've used the minuet that we played in the first half of the video by Marin, and I've written out versions that correspond to the descriptions of the port-de-voix given by Danneville, Rousseau and Bassy, just to sort of really illustrate how their approach to the port-de-voix changes the performance of this music. In the first half we were playing on-beat port-de-voix, and that sounds like this. But according to Danneville and Rousseau, the port-de-voix should be taken from the note preceding the main note. So in this case, that's the quaver F that forms the upbeat into bar 2. So instead of playing that as a single note, we have to split it in two. The first half of the note becomes two semiquavers, and the first semiquaver is tied to the previous material, but the second semiquaver is slurred into the downbeat of the next bar, so that we play the G minim on the beat as written, rather than interrupting it with the port-de-voix. And of course, also one plays the battement, which, as we saw in the previous video, is a very fast ornament, as you can see in the notation. So that would sound something like this. Do it again. Now, Bassy describes this pre/on beat port-de-voix, and here you can see that he takes the value of the port-de-voix from the preceding note, as do Danneville and Rousseau, but he sustains it across, in this case the bar line, into the main note, where it takes up a half of the value of the note, and is, or at least a good chunk of the value of the note, and is followed by the battement. So that would sound something like this. And again. Quite an interesting contrast, because Bassy's approach is both rhythmically disruptive, which in itself can be quite an effective rhetorical device, but also maintains the strenuous dissonance that creates such an expressive effect, which is lost if the Port-de-voix, often lost if the Port-de-voix is pre-beat. Interestingly, Saint-Colomb actually writes this out in his music. He doesn't very rarely uses the petite note to indicate a Port-de-voix, and instead he creates these kind of figures which resemble or are basically identical to the written out versions of this ornament that I've just provided. So you will often get a split semiquaver, two semiquavers, a sort of split quaver, the second of which is tied into a longer note with a little plus sign, a battement, exactly as you would have written out the Port-de-voix as described by Danneville or Rousseau. So the instinct is to play as written both of these semiquavers, the second as the pre-beat Port-de-voix. So we can take as an example La Tendre, the concert pour deux viols by Saint-Colomb, and we can see this immediately. In the first two bars, both viol parts have this figure written out. Now, the first viol player might be tempted to play the two semiquavers separately, and the second as this pre-beat Port-de-voix, like this. And that's perfectly fine. It works perfectly well. But once we add the second viol, then we start to realize that this interpretation of Saint-Colomb's Port-de-voix is missing something. Because in the second bar, if the second viol, rather than playing that second semiquaver B as a pre-beat Port-de-voix, instead extends that B into the C crotchet with the battement, suddenly we get some fantastic dissonance with the first part, because that B extends across and then becomes dissonant with the A in the first viol. So we end up with. So if the second viol player plays this, then halfway through that Port-de-voix we get this fantastic dissonance. So it seems to me that Saint-Colomb must have been referring to this slightly older vocal tradition as espoused by Bénigne de Bassilly. And it really illustrates how important it is to read the treatises and find out the musical context in which these performer composers were living. And it's also important to be aware of the possibility that even in Marais, the relatively late viol music, one has this option of extending the Port-de-voix beyond the simple on-beat performance practice that most people use most of the time. It's a really useful rhetorical device, and one can make a decision about its use according to the harmonic context. So that's basically it when it comes to the Port-de-voix. There's actually a lot to think about and a lot of decisions to be made in your music. But it's good to have these tools at one's disposal and to be aware of the context. I hope you found it useful. That's the end of this tutorial. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments box. And I will leave also a link to my website where you can join my Music -1 service, which will allow you to commission tutorials and also have access to my Music -1 recordings. I will see you in the next video, and in the meantime, have fun with the French ornaments.